Right. I'm Morgan, by the way.
Yeah, I'm Natalia.
Natalia, nice to meet you.
But yeah, I'm on the shared access. It's just like, you don't have enough people in this
I saw someone say that.
That was me.
Okay, yeah, I was like, I was just so annoyed that it's in my background. Like, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, because I will say, like, sometimes I have a problem with their kids because they got their hair busted and I have to like, and I was like,
General because
That's what I was saying.
they cut off. They cut them off.
you know what I'm sketchy people
And then you're gonna have to struggle
Don't walk the
it's always
neighborhood.
like, and also one of the big things is the Dutch River. They're gonna, like,
Oh, I think it's so nice.
they can't keep up.
So like there's a hill, so they can all stand up.
You know, all the wildlife, I'm a big wildlife person. That area is home to so many birds. I was by there, and it's just full of ants. And I hate to say it,
That's what I'm
I've been looking at
honestly, that's what we were talking about.
and it absolutely breaks my heart because this is where I grew up. I'm a national native.
Yeah.
So the lines go all the way back to
I grew up in Antioch. Yeah, I grew up right up the road.
Oh my God, we lived off Belgrade.
I lived on like Sailboat Drive.
Oh, okay, we were like off Belgrade. What street was it? But when you went to the
I know what you're talking
yeah,
about.
like I went down kind of near where the lake is, where
Yeah.
it is.
I went to Lakeview Elementary School. So,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. They probably lived with us in Antioch High.
Yeah. Well, they didn't let me go to public. I went to like East Allen.
Oh,
But Antioch, that's where I grew up.
yeah. Yeah, it just was getting so crowded. It's getting like, I can't drive in like Belleville. Just go anywhere.
I love Antioch. Like, it's so great. It's so great. And my family moved when we were 15 to Columbia. And I've been here ever since.
because that's one of the big things we should have done.
Trying to settle.
And then it's like, hey, by the way.
I'm gonna ask her.
It's 4 o'clock. We'll call the Columbia Municipal City Planning Commission meeting to order. We will start with a roll call.
Councilman Coleman, Dr. Martin,
Here.
Mayor Mulder,
Here.
Mr. Shannon,
Here.
Mr. Sloan,
Here.
Ms. Williams. Here. Mr. Goetz.
Here. With a quorum present, we'll continue with the meeting. I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. We have a rather large crowd. Kind of rules of conduct for the meeting is there's a sign-up sheet out front. When we get to the item on the agenda that you're here to discuss on, you would have signed up. We will call you to the podium. You'll get 3 minutes, state your name, address, and any concerns you may have. Well, next item is going to be acknowledgement of the official communications of the Columbia City Council on annexation and zoning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as you may recall at our last meeting, occasionally Planning Commission is actually behind City Council instead of ahead. So actually last month you were already briefed on their actions, but I can recap that for you real quick of the October's meeting. If that makes sense. So you
Yeah.
actually met after they met.
Yeah, we
So-
did. You kind of already recapped everything at that point.
Yep, it's unusual. It only happens once or twice a year. But but what they did in October was they had 7 ordinances that were related to your zoning ordinance amendments that you've been going through over the past year. All of those had passed on second consideration, as well as the first consideration on 2 additional zoning amendments that dealt with signs and special districts. There are also 2 ordinances that were dealing with land use action. One of those being the PUD Master Plan revision there at Napa Valley Way and Nashville Highway that passed on first consideration, as well as the rezoning from a light industrial to a Character District 5, which is a more urban design, there off of Carmack. So those last 2 items will come up tomorrow night.
Thank you, Mr. Keltner. Anybody have any questions, Mr. Keltner? Seeing none, the next item is the approval of minutes. Everyone should have had an opportunity to review minutes in your packet from last month's meeting.
Move to approve.
Second.
Have a motion by the mayor, second by Dr. Martin. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Dr. Martin,
Aye.
Mayor Mulder,
Aye.
Mr. Shannon,
Aye.
Mr. Sloan,
Aye.
Ms. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Goetz.
Aye. Minutes are approved. Next item, item 6, is review of bonds and letters of credit.
Are in order or in the process of being updated.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. This brings us to our consent items. I'll read the consent item. If anybody would like to pull that out for further discussion, please acknowledge. If not, we will entertain the motions. Only one item on our consent, request from Michael Williams for final plat approval with surety for Heritage Village subdivision consisting of 1.67 acres at Santa Fe Pike and River Heights Drive, being tax map 89E, Group B, parcels 17 through 20. Seeing no one acknowledging, I'll make a motion to approve, subject to staff technical comments.
Second.
I have a second by the mayor. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Dr. Martin,
Aye.
Mayor Mulder,
Aye.
Mr. Shannon,
Aye.
Mr. Sloan,
Aye.
Ms. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Goetz.
Aye. Items approved. Brings us to the first of our discussion items tonight. Number 1 is going to be the request from Stephen Sons for alternative compliance approval for property at 115 South James M. Campbell Boulevard, being tax map 113E, Group B, parcel 4, regarding architectural design standards listed.
Would like to note, at the time of this application, it was 70%. We reduced it down to 50. It's still right at 49%. But of that glazing, 0.56 is spandrel glass. And so the zoning code only allows for clear glass, and so that would be the alternative compliance exception with this. You can note here in the image, the area where the parapet is, that's where the spandrel glass is being proposed.
And did I understand you right? Of the 49%, 0.56% is spandrel glass?
That's correct.
Okay.
And so from my understanding and discussion with the architect, this is a one-story single-service building, and with the raised parapet, by putting clear glass there, it would create a challenge because it's basically utility area. It's not a true upper level. And so spandrel is not clear glass, and so that's what the exception would be for in this case.
So we're within a 1% of meeting our new ordinance, aside from the spandrel glass.
Aside from the spandrel glass. But keep in mind, unfortunately, when this came in, it was 70, and so it's still kind of rolling under the code before the amendment.
Gotcha.
And I was under the impression that on certain of these items that staff was going to have the ability to approve some of these variances, slight as they may be, especially considering now they've come back with seemingly having heard some concerns from last month and now providing what is a better elevated product, which is what we want. I think
Yes, sir.
Sort of a mission is accomplished here with respect to that. But was this something that staff either felt like we needed to see to make sure we were okay with it, but under other circumstances, staff could have approved this internally?
I do believe so, Mayor Mulder. I think at the time when the application came in, the code was 70% glazing. And so because it was such a stark deviation, staff felt more comfortable with Planning Commission this item coming before this commission. If this would have came after the code amendment, we're talking 1%, so to speak, I think this would have been something staff would have felt more comfortable to do in-house as a deviation.
Before the amendment, it would have been a much more significant deviation.
Correct, sir.
Once that is through. Okay. Well, I appreciate it. I did want to make sure that I was thinking that we had tried to make some efficiencies
Sure.
that did allow for staff to make some of those internal approvals. But with that, again, I appreciate staff working with the developer on this, on what is a even better product than what we had before us last month. Again, I think that is planning at its best here, and so kudos to them and to staff for facilitating that.
Thank you.
I'll make a motion to approve, subject to technical comments.
Second.
I have a motion by the mayor, second by Dr. Martin. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Councilman Coleman,
Aye.
Dr. Martin, Aye. Mayor Mulder.
Aye.
Mr. Shannon,
Aye.
Mr. Sloan,
Aye.
Ms. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Goetz.
Aye. My item passes. I guess, and for the record, we'll note that Mr. Coleman is with us now. So. Next item on our agenda, number 2, is going to be a request from Alan O'Leary for preliminary and final plat approval with surety for a commercial 3-lot subdivision at tax map 89E, parcel 41.14 off North James Campbell Boulevard. And I do see noted here that the applicant is requesting a deferral on this item.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. As they continue to work with staff, if I remember right, I think last month.
It's more internal than staff
Okay.
among themselves.
Well, if it's upon applicant's request, I think I'll be, make a motion to defer.
Second.
Second by Mr. Shannon. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Councilman Coleman,
Aye.
Dr. Martin, Aye. Mayor Mulder,
Aye.
Mr. Shannon,
Aye.
Mr. Sloan,
Aye.
Ms. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Goetz.
Aye. Item is deferred. Item 3 on our agenda is request from Jim Gillum for site development plan approval at 1224 Trotwood Avenue, being tax map 100J, Group D, parcel 37.
Thank you, Mr. Goetz. This is a very unique site development plan coming before y'all because Murray Regional Hospital is an existing site with all existing site conditions. And so staff did with the best of their ability in working with the applicant to adhere to the zoning code. So the property currently is zoned civic. Civic zoning is pretty loose. It doesn't have min or max building sites. Setbacks are minimal. So it is an appropriate zone that the hospital's in, fortunately. But nevertheless, the hospital is under a complete site modification plan for the exterior parking areas, including the elimination of curb cuts. With this request, it does indicate that there will be a new defined entrance that will align with Blythewood Drive with a proposed traffic signal. In front of that entrance will be a monument sign and a civic green space with walking trails throughout that. One thing that this site development plan does is it takes the parking lots that are existing and puts them into individual building sites. And so the civic zoning does allow for a parking lot to be on its own building site by itself. The limited use standard in the code states that when you do have a parking lot on your own building site, that there does have to be a perimeter fence. And so with this request, they are showing a very decorative perimeter fence along Trotwood Avenue with stone pillars throughout the development. The 2 key things that staff did point out in the site development plan that would not adhere, and I did discuss this with the applicant, are 2 things that are pretty significant. The first being the parking lot that you see in front of the new proposed entrance. Number 1 there indicates and also where you see where the parking lot is being, the parking areas are being circled, those are ADA compliant parking spots. And so what that does is it puts those parking spots into a first layer because the principal building where the hospital site is its own building site. And so there's parking in the first layer for ADA compliance. And then one additional thing that's pointed out is the zoning code requires for every 10 spaces there be an interior landscape island. Where the 3 circles are indicate where there's not a landscape island, and 1 would be required there. Something new in the zoning code is this concept of alternative performance. And so alternative performance would indicate something that can be deviated from the code in exchange for something greater. And so staff did note that if the applicant would wish to proceed with this ADA parking in the first layer, that would be something that the commission would have to approve as alternative performance. And then also in discussing with the applicant regarding the interior parking stalls, it was from my understanding that the hospital had a pretty hard number of parking spaces that they did not want to lose. And in order to meet those parking space numbers, they wanted to also save a few heritage trees that were on site. And so there were some readjustments to areas where parking could go. And that was the justification for not having the landscape islands there. Certainly the applicant can kind of delve deeper into the reasoning for not showing the landscape islands. But again, that would be a code requirement per every 10 spaces. And I think this, can y'all hear me? I think this thing was cutting out here. I was talking to you
I think
also.
you're getting the volume, there's a little bit of a feedback in there.
Okay.
But other than that, yeah, it's picking you up, so. Yeah, on this new site, the site plan, there's some improvements that are made from the existing, if I'm correct. You know, some sidewalks, some walkability. It looks like there's an access road that kind of travels through the whole thing. So just from a traffic flow perspective, does staff see this as a significant improvement from the existing layout?
100, what it does, so it's in circumnavigation sidewalk on one side. And likewise, whenever you have more than 100 8-foot sidewalk, so on both. So nevertheless, it's grossly not working with, albeit
Got you. Any questions with Mr. Brass?
Austin, I know this was kind of late developing for you on some of the explanations with the architect, but was his reasoning on the internal landscape islands was to try to save the larger tree there that fronts Trotwood there that was...
Yeah, landscape islands, so there's no significant. Nothing like.
Right. Right. What I took. That's what I kind of understood his explanation was.
Also would like to add to heritage tree. Fortunately, removing some of those.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman.
Mr. Braston, I understand the interior islands essentially are not there in order to have this heritage tree that's kind of down a little bit, I guess, southwest. We're looking at the picture of this one here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's either kind of one or the other for them?
I think that does create somewhere. Really. But by putting the landscape out, hardship essentially.
At 4 to 5, we know that that's the number basically that they're losing.
So landscape.
Okay, great, thank you.
I think the applicant, is the applicant in here today? Working on the electronics there.
I had noticed during study session making some funny noises.
Was it?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy.
Beautiful. Just would have liked to listen to myself over intercom, but yes, Mr. Chairman, Jim Gillum with Wald Architects and Engineers, and on the parking spaces, that's an existing lot in front of the medical office building, and we were just trying to salvage. I mean, their goal, the hospital's goal, is adding as much parking as they can. They definitely have a shortage of parking, and it was, we definitely wanted to save the trees. There's 4 large oak trees along Trotwood that we were able to reconfigure and save, and we made the islands larger, giving them enough room for the root zone, and to not try to encroach on the existing trees, we just kind of looked at it and asking to be able to save 5 more parking spaces in front of the MOB there.
And this is in front of, I think it's like a surgery building or some other ancillary building there, if I remember.
So as you go from west to east, there's a hospital, the medical office building, and then a pavilion that actually has some expansion going on in the back of it now. And then to the far east, there's a clinic.
Okay.
So this is the middle building of the 3 that are north of Trotwood.
I think this is that medical building that typically pretty full now when most times is.
Exactly, yes, sir.
And I think it was mentioned, but it's the hospital's plan with the new ingress egress here across from Blythe to put in a traffic signal and improve that whole area.
That is the desire. We have a traffic study that's under third-party review at the time and waiting to get their comments back. So definitely would like that. I mean, be safer there's a lot of employees that actually walk across the street. The hospital has a facility on the other side south side of Trotwood, as well as going to restaurants. So traffic signal, pedestrian crosswalks, ramps, and signals there is the desire.
Thank you. Questions?
I'm actually, on the advice of the city attorney, going to recuse myself from this matter. So I just want to put on the record that I will recuse myself and abstain from voting. Although I did have a question related to the traffic issue. I think I can still ask the question because it's really just procedural to the city engineer. How does the approval process go for signalization on what is considered a state route?
So the applicant submitted the traffic signal warrant analysis. It's under review. It looks like it's going to be approved and warrant a signal at the location. The applicant would make application to the state for the roadway improvements, not so much the signal. All the signal work and signal function is a function of the city. So TDOT would just approve the geometric work in the intersection area. The city would concur with that, and TDOT would issue the permit.
All right, thank you.
So what we're looking at is the alternative compliance. So, Mr. Brass, I think just we're looking at seeking approval under the alternative compliance.
Yeah, so just to clarify for the commission, alternative compliance is just a design-related terminology in the zoning code. Alternative performance would be site-related. So in this case, there's a criteria in the code for alternative performance. Just to note, if the commission wishes to grant the alternative conformance, just make sure in the motion that we just state a reason for what makes this exceptional to grant in moving forward. And there is a criteria that's also listed in the staff report. I believe it's
that'd be 856J.
Yeah, it'll be on page
9 and 12, I believe.
Chairman Coates.
Yes, sir, Mr. Sloan.
Yeah,
page
I'm
9.
ready
Thank
to make
you.
a motion, but I have some ammunition that you can put in there for your wording.
If you've got some comments, please go ahead and.
Just as a professional opinion, obviously accessible parking spots being adjacent to an entry is very important. The closer the better. And grass is easier to grow than a tree. That's what I would throw in there.
Gotcha. Thank you. Well, and I can add to that. I think that the improvements that are being proposed here today, I completely understand the need for for ADA accessible in front of the hospital. I mean, that's, yeah, and the improvements of just the internal drive that's going through there, the proposed traffic signal that's going to go up with safety for the citizens that I see walking across there, to not just employees, but, visitors there that are going to McDonald's and other fast food restaurants across the street. So to know that improvements are going to be made, I think in a continuation of the sidewalk that goes down, through there. And also, did I understand there's even some stone fencing that's going to go up?
That's right, because they're utilizing parking lots as a principal use, so there has to be a
aesthetic
barrier.
improvements alone, I mean, I think all of those would meet the criteria for a motion to approve under those guidelines. So,
And Mr. Goetz, would that be a motion for the interior landscape islands and the ADA parking?
yeah, I would. I would approve. As presented here today. So, make a motion to approve.
Second.
A second by Mr. Coleman. Any further discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, for the record, I just need to say that I am not on the board of directors, but I am on the foundation, a non-voting ambassador. I plan to vote tonight.
Okay, thank you for that. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we will call the vote.
Councilman Coleman.
Aye.
Dr. Martin.
Aye.
Mayor Moser.
Abstain.
Mr. Shannon.
Aye.
Mr. Sloan.
Aye.
Ms. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Goetz.
Aye. Items approved.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item on our agenda tonight, item 4, request from Greg Gamble to rezone property at tax map 90, parcel 7.12, being a 5-acre tract at River Road and Taylor Bend from PUD, Plan Unit Development, to a CD5 Urban Center Character District with revocation of the Water's Edge at Taylor's Bend PUD. Prior to the meeting, I was informed that the applicant is requesting a deferral on this item. He has learned that there is an HOA change from the developer to the HOA, and he is requesting this to set up a meeting to meet with the HOA and the members of the neighborhood. He did tell us that he will make himself available outside for everybody here today to acknowledge and give him your contact information so he can schedule said meeting. So based upon that, I'm going to, based on the applicant's request, I'm going to make a motion to defer this item at the applicant's request.
A second.
Have a second by Mr. Shannon.
I would just add that it seems like there's an opportunity here to capture a audience that is available and ready to talk about this. So I would encourage that to occur, and hopefully some good conversation can happen and positive results take place. So I would encourage that for the developer, considering that I think a large number of folks who are here this evening were here for this item that are now just for the first time learning, as we are, that it's being requested for deferral. So,
and I'll add to that too, just please keep in mind that when this item does come back up on our agenda, you will still have yet another opportunity to come back, in addition to what is spoken to at your meeting, to still have your right to express your concerns. So with that said, any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Councilman Coleman.
Aye.
Dr. Martin.
Aye.
Mayor Moser.
aye.
Mr. Shannon.
Aye.
Mr. Sloan.
Aye.
Ms. Williams.
Aye.
Mr. Goetz.
Aye. Item is deferred. At this moment, before we move on to item 5, if everybody would like to, if you want to stick around for discussion of item 5, but I'll take a moment and a pause. I think item 5 could be some discussion, so if you want to go ahead and exit, and I'll let that happen.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
So I just want to make a note, this would have been the last current planning item I would have presented to the Planning Commission. So Mr. Keltner will take over on this case when it comes back next month. And I'd ask the applicant to communicate with him about any communication he has with the neighborhood, so we're able to reflect that in an update to the staff report.
Okay, all right. I'll, Mr. Cutler, will you make sure that Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, I'll go,
knows?
Greg.
Thank you. And I'm sad to hear that, but I understand.
Well, his last case is actually the zoning text amendments that's coming up.
All right. This brings us to our last item on our agenda tonight, item 5, request from Gary Harrison for preliminary PUD master plan approval for Honey Farm subdivision consisting of 174 townhome lots and 9 open space lots at tax map 51, parcel 58 off Honey Farm Way.
Thank you, Mr. Goetz. This was an item that the Planning Commission previously seen. It went on to City Council with a recommendation unanimously of denial from this commission. The council had agreed to allow this item to come back before Planning Commission, and the applicant did make a few changes from the previous submittal that was seen at the last Planning Commission meeting back in August. The item still is requesting a deviation from the zoning standards for a PUD R to allow a side yard setback from 10 feet to 7.5 feet, and then also a rear setback that is less than 10 feet. And so that deviation did not change from the initial submittal. The next deviation requested was to allow for the retaining walls, walkways, driveways, and alleys in the required 75-foot buffer on the north boundary line. That deviation is still being requested. The next deviation we had a lot of discussion on is regarding the alleyway being used for a fire apparatus to come through. The current zoning code requires all alleyways to be 20 feet of right-of-way, and the applicant is wishing to increase that alley width to 30 feet to allow for a fire apparatus. However, they are adding fire sprinkler suppression systems for townhome units 83 to 86 and units 154 to 163. And so that is an added item with this request. The next deviation is regarding the design elevations. The zoning code requires a 5-foot window sill height, and they are requesting the window sill height to be 4 feet. And then the last deviation is regarding retaining walls. So the current zoning code, when you're proposing retaining walls on building sites, they're not to exceed 3 feet in the front yard and 4 feet in the required side yards. The applicant did make modifications to reduce those retaining walls along Honey Farm Way and along the area where the cursor is through some regrading of the site and reducing that section of the wall. And also the applicant did note that all one-car driveways on the site were removed to discourage parking in the alleyways, not to obstruct fire access. And so those were the changes that were being made. I would like to note that the applicant did put together a special presentation for the commission, and so this may be an opportunity to hear their presentation, and certainly we can ask questions at the end. So
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Call the applicant forward.
Good evening, Planning Commission. We appreciate the opportunity to come again before you tonight. I think I just want to start out by saying that after our first discussion with the Planning Commission, it was clear that we weren't prepared enough to give a kind of a comprehensive explanation of really the scope of the variances that we're requesting. We prepared this presentation before we went to City Council because we wanted to be prepared to discuss the nuances. There was a good question and answer dialogue during that meeting. We left with some additional items that we were asked to address. I think that the two major ones were kind of nailing down the fire code issue for the alleys, and then secondly, to try to do a better job reducing some of the retaining wall requirements. But I'll just run through this presentation comprehensively, trying to hit on each of the variances to, I think, do what we should have done the first time, which is better explain to you these variances that we're asking for, because in kind of the broad scope, yes, there is a number of variances, but we believe that we've minimized, where they apply on this site. It's not a variance to get, to get a variance from a certain code across the whole site. It's for specific areas around the site. So with that, Kevin, you mentioned its clicker is here. A little bit of context. This project is 174 townhomes. We're at 6.6 units to the acre. The PUD R allows up to 12 units to the acre max, so we're well below max density requirement. There was some discussion around the current PUD that is in place since 2006 and then amended in 2015. There was some question at City Council about whether or not the previous PUD standards still apply. We did consult a legal land use attorney on this issue, and just for context, because the question came up, there is still some legal permission for us to use the same permissions that were accounted for in that 2015 amendment. I mean, that's not why we're here today. We're here today to talk about this townhome application, but I just did want to, for the benefit of the group here, answer that question. The comprehensive plan and the future land use map show this area as city center, urban village. And, that's a mixed use overlay. It's a commercial and more robust residential use category. The PUD-R standard that we're currently zoned at, it's our impression that this site was designated as PUD-R because at the time it had a PUD when it was switched over to the new zoning ordinance, and it makes sense to be PUD-R. But those PUD-R standards, as I'll show you on the next slide, aren't real compatible with commercial and denser residential uses. Again, here we're looking at a townhome development, all alley loaded, with architectural elevations that meet the intent and the criteria in the current ordinance. The next slide here kind of delves a little more deeply into the nature of the PUD, and really us just trying to connect the dots between the current PUD-R zoning and some of the other zonings that are allowed in the CCUV zone or comprehensive plan overlay. We're trying to bridge the gap between the PUD-R, which is more suited towards a single family residential use, and a CD4 type zoning, which is more compatible with a commercial and a medium to high density residential use. And within the PUD, though, I think we do have the benefit of at least requesting variances. That's one of the functions of the PUD. There are some criteria for how that works. We have to, show proof of unique site conditions. We're not guaranteed approval of variances. But this site in particular has a couple of physical characteristics that have required us to kind of come in and ask for some of these variances so that we can meet the requirements in the ordinance. As you guys have become more familiar with your ordinance and understand, the minimum and maximum setbacks and frontage requirements on thoroughfares, we're trying to meet those requirements and also meet the physical site characteristics. We have a fair amount of topo starting kind of at the low point along Honey Farm Way. Our site slopes up pretty quickly. Engineering staff has asked that we provide a roadway connection from the roundabout to the north along our northern property line. That road's got about an 8+% slope. And so as we meet the bulk standards for setbacks and frontage along Honey Farm, and then the subsequent roads that stack up behind that, that's where the retaining wall requests come into play. We're trying to meet the frontage requirements and the setback requirements and step our site up through the project. So those are those unique site conditions that we believe kind of trigger our request for some of these variances, which are allowed if approved under the PUD criteria. I think that those are really some of the two driving factors for some of the main ones. As I move on to the next slide, I wanted to talk about the setback deviations. As I mentioned, to do a townhome and a commercial type development, the criteria for those are found, in straight zoning in your CD4 and CD4C criteria. The PUD-R ones have bigger setbacks for more single-family detached type residential uses. And so I just wanted to draw a few comparisons between those two. Currently under PUD-R, the front setback is between 15 and 35 feet. Again, that's kind of more for that single-family use. The sides are larger at 10. The rears are at 10. Under CD4, where you find townhomes, the front setback is between 6 and 20 feet, and the side setbacks are at 6. And what we tried to do was request a deviation that was not all the way to CD4, but somewhere in between CD4 and PUD. So that's how we got to the 7.5 foot It also allows us to be more consistent with, I think, the intent of the CCUV, which is a more urban streetscape and context where buildings are spaced closer to the street and closer together. And again, we're still well under the density that was both approved in the 2015 PUD and currently allowed under the CD4. So again, just trying to draw a few comparisons there. Our next deviation request was for the buffer along our northern property line. Again, it's worth pointing out that the CD4 and CD4C buffer in this area would be 25 feet, but the PUDR standard is 75. So just drawing some comparisons. And then I wanted to point out that the area highlighted with the red dashed line and the yellow overlay is the 75-foot buffer that's required. As I mentioned before, our deviation is not for a kind of a gross disregard to the 75-foot buffer. I'd say 90+% of this buffer area, we are complying with the 75-foot buffer. There's just a few isolated incidents where portions of a retaining wall or an alley do encroach. And that's, again, trying to maintain the form that is outlined and enforced in the CD4 zoning districts and in your ordinance kind of as a whole. So again, just trying to point out the level of encroachment and variance that we're requesting with the buffer. Our next slide is regarding the alley. A few things to point out here. There was a collaborative discussion here with both planning and the fire department. We continue to have these. The main goal is public health and safety. The fire department's fire code says they need to have a 20-foot wide paved surface for fighting fires. Your current alley is in a 20-foot right-of-way with a 16-foot pavement section. So what we're proposing is that we widen the right-of-way so that we can do a 20-foot pavement section. And we've also widened it a little more so that we can provide an extra utility line and fire hydrants in that alley. The fire department has said, we need you to meet the fire code. This proposal meets the fire code. We have offered above and beyond that to sprinkle the buildings that are outside of the hose pull requirement. The fire department requires that wherever they park a truck on a public right-of-way, they need to be able to pull a fire hose to within 150 feet to fight that fire. Now, while our 30-foot alley and the 20-foot pavement provides that for them, just for additional assurances, because this is a dense residential subdivision, we wanted to offer that we would sprinkle those 4 buildings that are in question here. So that's where things stand. The main variance request in this regard is really just that the engineering department and the planning department allow us to do a larger right-of-way than is currently defined in the engineering standards. And then lastly, the retaining walls. I think that was probably the biggest area of discussion at City Council. I think we heard it from y'all at Planning Commission. We heard it again at City Council that those retaining walls, especially along Honey Farm Way, were concerning. There's questions about what the guardrail looks like. I'll get to that on the second slide. But here, I just wanted to point out kind of some before and after conditions. We went back to the drawing board and tried to change the conditions on how we put steps to the front porches and handle our grading from the sidewalks in front of the units to the face of the building. And what we've done is shorten the walls and eliminated some of the walls. The elevation right below the text, I know it's a little hard to see on your screens and at this scale, but we had retaining wall heights around 9 feet in some areas along Honey Farm Way. We have reduced all of the wall heights to a maximum of 7.5 feet on our current plan, and we've reduced the amount of the tapering as well on either side of that highest point of the wall, and that's with some of the changes that we made to the front porch stairs and front porch conditions. We've also been able to go internal to the development. You can see a few items that are pointed out where we've removed some walls entirely, and where we have reduced walls that were previously not compliant to be compliant. So we've reduced the amount of non-compliant retaining walls in the front and side yards. So again, we went back to the drawing boards, and and tweak some engineering so that we could reduce the concerns regarding the retaining walls. On the south part of the site, we went from a wall that exceeded 3 feet in the front yard to one that was 3 feet or less. So we have, no non-compliant walls on the south portion of the site. And then we provided a photograph there of the type of wall that we plan to build. It'll be a brick faced wall with a decorative guardrail or fencing on top. So, there were some questions at City Council. Is this going to be a T-dot guardrail? We kept on referring to it as a guardrail, and that's more of a technical term for a railing that is at least 42 inches tall so that it protects people on the top of a wall that has excessive height to it. But again, we're going to do our best to do an attractive wall with an attractive railing on top of that to, take care of those conditions above the wall. And I think that is pretty much all that we wanted to share with you tonight. I think I'll just end on this last slide that does quickly kind of go through our elevations. Again, we've got high quality materials. We got masonry. We have hardy siding, both board and batten, and shingle and horizontal siding with, a mix of color palettes to try to create a real attractive product for this development. There is that one deviation from the sill height from 5 to 4 feet for the window sills. Again, as we understand it, that's been a variance that has been granted on other developments in the past. So with that, I'll give it back to you guys and see if there's any questions or clarifications that I can help out with.
Thank you, Mr. Rowland. I do see that Drew Smith, I don't know if you just signed up, if you want to add to anything or, okay. Gotcha. Appreciate the presentation, Mr. Rowland. I think what I'm gathering is you put some pretty extensive work into reducing the height of the retaining walls and things of that nature. Still have some exceptions you're requesting, in this application is, for the what the PUD requires the maximum to be and what you're presenting here today. There's still some that exceed that maximum requirement, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And I think what you were trying to point out and achieve is showing what CD4 would allow, but we're not looking at CD4. You're just doing that as a kind of a comparison. I think PUD still requires townhomes. That's the correct statement, right? The PUD, and it's still, would require, it still allows the townhomes that's being presented under the PUD. You're just saying if it was a CD4, some of those side setbacks and things like that would not be required, but what we're looking at today is under the PUD requirements. The alleyway, our ordinance wasn't set up, this might be a staff question or, but to allow fire access through alleyways, and we're trying to achieve that by widening the minimum requirements for an alleyway. Is that an accurate way of reviewing this?
Yes, sir.
Did that set a precedence for future developers wanting to come in and put alleyways in and, meet the fire code requirements by just widening the alleyway instead of making it the street that would be required based on the standards?
Well, normally you would see this in PUD-related type scenarios only. I don't believe the Planning Commission would have the authority to grant a variance to that, but they could, I guess, essentially amend the engineering standards with regards to that. We purposely put it at that narrowness to put the fire service toward the front and using public right-of-ways. We have, as you know, alleys have become more and more private, that you've seen some as they've come through the system for that. So far as precedent, it would be new to us. And there again, we deliberately put the standards to where they are to put the fire service in a certain way. This is coming about from the standpoint of the distance from the thoroughfare and the ability to front a non-frontage. So in other words, you granted some allowances for some of the buildings not to front a street. But in doing so, it's created to some degree the request to, it's too far away from the fire code. So your ordinance says up to a certain percentage. There's no guarantee that you can meet that percentage. But if they want to try to meet that percentage, then it would be difficult to do without having a fire apparatus go behind the structure there.
So is that problem not getting resolved by virtue of the fire sprinkler suppression system that they're willing to install in those units where that would be applicable to, or are there more units beyond that that are at play?
No, sir. So there's two different roads, two different alleys. I keep calling them roads. Alleys. One of them has 9 units. One of them has 10 units on it.
Okay.
The fire sprinkler is not a requirement of the fire marshal's office. It's
Right.
something that they're asking or they're volunteering to do. The fire code itself is just looking at how wide does it have to be for them to take an apparatus down the road, and then also to Josh's point there, you have to also incorporate utilities at that point, infrastructure, fire hydrants, things of that nature that has to come involved in that, where you normally just see that on the street. So from a fire point, that's, as Josh said, if it is going to be the 20-foot wide hard surface, then it meets their fire code at that point. What we're saying is that when we developed the alley section, we intentionally made it narrow to where you could not use the alley as a fire service.
Conceptually, the way that it was always described to me is sprinklers get people out of the building. They don't necessarily save the building.
Sure.
And so like the fire truck would help preserve adjacent buildings and kind of that sort of level of thing. I think, and I didn't understand that fully, Mr. Keltner, until you explained it again, but it's a hardship on purpose, right? Like you made the alleyway 20 so that a fire truck couldn't there, and it forces the fire trucks to go around and not have the alley be a road, because then there's other requirements that a road has that an alley wouldn't.
It's the same purpose of not having alleys become your major network of access.
It's the reason they're alleys.
That's right.
And if I may, I appreciate Paul pointing out a second ago that there is a provision in the ordinance that allows us up to 20% of our units to not front a thoroughfare. And, again, we've tried to minimize that on this plan, and we've tried to minimize the amount of buildings that are beyond that 150 feet. But here, because of just, a few feet in a few different directions, in order to meet, to use the code that's been provided to allow units to front to green space, and then to provide the fire department with what they see as a minimum width for pavement. That's the request that's before you tonight.
So I guess my other procedural question is making an exception here is an exception to a PUD, not an exception to our. I don't know. I feel like if it set a precedent unto this exact PUD.
It does open yourself up to a why granted here and not in another situation. What is special about this particular request that you may not see in another site?
And I think if you were receptive to the applicant's request, you might want to articulate that very specifically, that, like where my cursor is, to Mr. Rowland's point, that the code allows you to in-front up to 20% of your lots or building sites to something other than a thoroughfare, and that creates a situation where, well, how are you supposed to get fire access there? So if the Planning Commission was open to this at all, I'd be sure to tailor the deviation from the default standards to that circumstance rather than broadly across the whole development, so that in the future you can distinguish it from other situations.
I mean, I think what I'm seeing here is a bunch of variances to achieve a target number of units instead of trying to reduce number of units to not ask for variances. I mean, you're wanting a variance for the alleyway for fire typically that we, in our ordinance wouldn't allow. You want variances for retaining walls that you want side setback variances, all these variances to, I guess, to maximize your number of units. Would that be an accurate way of?
I mean, that is always a factor, but I truly believe as a planner who studied your ordinance that the larger percentage of these variances are because of us trying to meet the intent of the ordinance. These bulk, these frontage requirements, these the intent for these new communities to have a more urban and building forward streetscape and appeal. If you look at, if we could get the presentation back up on my fire slide, there are some units that front to Honey Farm Way. And in order to meet the intent of how the alley is used there, these buildings are pulled a little bit off Honey Farm Way so they can be in compliance with the block behind it. And, in that instance, I don't think we would choose to do it. That's the one in the bottom right-hand corner. I don't think we'd choose to do that differently if we're still fronting units to Honey Farm Way. We're, complying with the alley, but it's just because we're a little bit beyond that 150-foot hose pull that we're widening that alley there. I mean, Mr. Goetz, your point could be argued for the building in the top. We could, remove those two buildings and all of a sudden we're in compliance. We don't need a 30-foot alley, but, land is very expensive. And, the site constraints that I mentioned before where we've got steep slopes going up, it really doesn't allow another road up there. So we're just trying to, we've met the civic space requirements. We've met predominantly the buffer requirements. We're doing our best to meet the intent of the ordinance as it relates to the bulk standards and the form. And so we're trying to hit as many of those buttons as we can and reduce the, how wide reaching those variance requests are. And again, it's 4 buildings over the course of, I don't know if it's 60 buildings or so, but quite a few.
I do recall the retaining wall issue being an issue that was of concern, and it looks like there's been effort made to at least reduce the requested variance there, which I appreciate. I think I maybe had this question last time, Mr. Keltner, and you and maybe this is also just the need for a procedural update, but they were denied at Planning Commission, but went forward to City Council with their sort of updates based upon what they had heard from Planning Commission. City Council decided to send it back to Planning Commission, which happens often when changes are made in between, really either way. And so that's how we're back here today.
That's right.
And then where I got hung up last time was on wanting to ensure that we not find ourselves into a situation that if this is denied as they've presented it, what their options would be in terms of just straight zone or building out what they're already entitled for now. And that was where I was a little confused on what is it currently entitled for, and would we be doing something to spite ourselves here to not grant this, which is a good product that is requiring and requesting some variances, because the alternative could be something that is much higher density, that we would be forced to approve, not forced, but you know what I'm saying, as opposed to here having something with much less density than what would be allowable. And I'm just trying to figure out what it's entitled to now so that I have a better idea of whether or not the variances being requested are something that I could justify.
Sure. So I guess their next process, so say this did not move forward and they decide to come back and just try to work with what was vested on the property.
Right.
It would still come before this body, a final master plan for that. You would still be looking at any exceptions that they're requesting at that point, as well as just seeing the layout for that. So it did have the approval of the 288. It did not move forward with a final on that, so it did not expire. It still sits there unless this body expires that particular plan. But they would still have to come before you to, as far as placements, some of the road infrastructure and in parking areas, things of that nature. So the preliminary was pretty high level in what got approved. I'll put it that way. There wasn't much detail in the preliminary.
Okay.
So when it came back, it would be much higher detail.
So at a minimum, what they are entitled to, or what they have vested rights in, would be for what could be up to 288 units. Mm-hmm. Whereas what they're requesting here would be 174 units.
Yes, sir.
And so we run that risk of, again, because of getting hung up in some of these variance requests that we could deny something and they could come back and approve something that, if density is one of the overall concerns in this corridor, in this area, although I think there are going to be a lot of improvements once that traffic light is installed, and I know that that's in the process somewhere along the way. I just have seen this happen before, where we've denied something based upon some variance requests, and in hindsight, maybe, what we ended up getting was something that, if we'd have known, that, we would have probably not wanted to have made that mistake. And so that's the concern that I have about the just sort of blanket denial because of the amount of variance requests here based upon what they do have vested rights on. I do always, as Vice Mayor Martin knows, want to make sure that we're not doing anything relative to fire that could impact ISO 1 ratings, and I don't believe that any of these variances would be doing anything to do that. So anyway, I just, again, wanted to know what they were vested in, and recognizing that they have 288 units that they have vested rights in, recognizing that they would have to bring a plan in place for approval to make sure we're cognizant that, what ultimately could happen as opposed to what they're seeking tonight.
Mr. Coleman.
Mr. Keltner, kind of continuing on with that a little bit, I guess, but the 228, if they were to come back with that, that's still going to have to conform to, the same rules, correct? They'll have to fit 228 into, is that even possible to conform to our rules without asking for variances and still get 228 in there?
Well, I guess the rules portion is the more gray area. So PUDs are very unique in how they are set up. So the rules were not very defined in the preliminary one. Basically, you're just seeing the density and a general layout of it. So whether you go in and make adjustments to how it looks, the type of buildings, the access points, the landscaping, civic amenities, all those things, those are still things yet to be determined because we have not seen that final plan yet. Did that answer your question on that?
Somewhat. So essentially, there would be a going back to the drawing board that they would need to do to try to get basically rework this whole plan, essentially, right?
You're creating the rules in a manner. The PUD standards are a guidance for you in that. That's why you have the deviations to look at it. Your PUDs are above the standard. So deviations should be having a deviation, and then how is it helping the site, and then what has it done to elevate the site even more so. They're not just a way to not comply with your standards, so to speak. So if that plan was to move forward, that's where you look at it and go, all right, here's all the things that we want to see for this site. But they are guaranteed the 288, and that's what they're guaranteed, and the multifamily unit itself.
But what we don't know is there and maybe I'm wrong on this, but is there a version of this plan that could be 228 or 228 and
288?
280. It was 288. 288. And conform. Without requesting variance. It just feels like if we were to not allow this, then maybe something would be reworked. That'd be better. I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of different plans, and this one it just does not feel like it fits this area. It is the minimum. It's 0.4 more than the minimum open space. It's a 5% open space is required. This is 5.4, so almost the very minimum amount of civic space.
If I might, to try to answer your specific question about what would be allowed, we did consult a land use attorney about that question because this PUD is so old, 2005 or 2006, and then amended in 2015 for this multifamily use. It was, and I believe we're submitting a letter to the city attorney just as a kind of a brief to say, hey, this is what we believe to be the case under Tennessee law, is that because this PUD was approved and then acted upon, and there's been continuous construction going on, that we would have the right to get the 288 units entitled under the ordinance with which it was approved, which means we could use the previous ordinance to get the 288 approved. And as you all recall, and one of the reasons that the new ordinance happened was because the old PUD allowed us to come and request pretty much, whatever it was we felt like we needed to do a development. And it was, for you all to kind of, analyze based on the merits of a proposal, not how the current ordinance exists, where you set up a very broad list of PUD criteria and then request variations off of that. So we would come to you with a request for 288 multifamily units. That's not our goal here. Under the old PUD criteria, which basically says, here's our request under the PUD, which we're allowed to. It's not an easy thing to compare today, but that is what our legal counsel told us we wouldn't be reviewed under the new ordinance, would be under the previous one.
And I apologize if that's what I come across as saying. What I was saying was that I'm not going to argue the point that it might be in 3638, but no matter what version it's in, you can ask for whatever you want to ask because it's planned unit development. So that what it comes under is really the moot point. It's what you want that to look like. So yes, they are vested for 288. What that development looks like is really up for grabs right now because there's nothing set with the details to get into some of that finer points that you're looking at this particular development now today.
I think that we need to stay focused on what we are looking at today, and not what could potential legal counsel argue out of what could be available, but right now it's just what's presented to here today to decide upon. So,
but Councilmember Coleman, I think where you were going with that is okay, fine. So 288 is what they're vested with, but if they can't even figure out a way to get 174 to work with the space that they have, how in the world will they get to 288? But then the question is what ordinance are they traveling under in order to get there? Because I think that's an important thing to know. There's some wastewater pump station improvements here that are occurring as well. Is that right, Mr. Kellner? It seems like we've talked about this as it relates to other properties across the street, or perhaps it's been a question or a conversation I've had with Mr. Boshears. Can you refresh my recollection on that?
There's been a lot of conversation back and forth on the sewer availability and what improvements that may have to happen with that. It kind of speaks volumes to the complexity of PUDs in general, considering each one is its own unique set of circumstances and rules. And in this particular case, there's multiple PUDs essentially in one PUD. If you kind of look at it that way, how it's been broken out. I believe Ryan and Filipkowski is here with wastewater as well, but they have worked out how to sewer this number of units here for this that I believe both parties have agreed to. Am I speaking correctly? Okay, so Ryan's shaking his head as well. So they did have discussions with that, and I believe both parties are okay with the sewer portion.
But did this, and I'm glad to see we had somebody from wastewater here. It didn't see him in the back corner, and he may be able to help on this as well. But does this impact the ability for the across the street property owner to tap into a pump station? Do you know, does that ring a bell with anything you've had any contact with? Because I know there's been some issues regarding sewer availability on property across the street. I just wondered if you could speak to that.
So I would say it does not affect them. The property across the street is going to need to do the improvements if it isn't done by this developer. It will need to be done to open it up across Nashville Highway.
The improvements to the pump station that would be across the street, they would have to do the improvements if this developer did not have to do the improvements. But this developer, they have some form of vested rights in the availability that their availability letter regarding sewer potentially impacts others' ability to also get availability for sewer?
So
it's
in
a
there,
terrible question, by the way it's articulated, but it sounds like you maybe were about to.
I might be able to clear it up. So their availability letter has that they have to upgrade that pump station, and if it's upgraded, it would open up that Nashville Highway property across Nashville Highway to a point where they could get some commercial development.
But if this development is not approved tonight or next month, then would that property owner across the street have to make upgrades to the pump station, or could they not then just tie into what's existing?
So the development is at a point where basically engineering opinion comes into play, and so they would still need to do the upgrade themselves, is what the numbers come down to.
Somebody's got to upgrade the pump station.
Someone's going to have to upgrade this pump station, yes.
Even if in order to expand the capacity?
To that, yes, the upper pump station in Honey Farm, the first pump station kind of near the townhomes there in the beginning portions of the development.
And so even if that property across Nashville Highway did not have the demand that required the upgrades, there still would be upgrades required nonetheless?
Yes.
So it's really the first to get approval would be the one.
Yeah, and it's in their availability letter, and I believe that other property has not requested. The developer has not requested availability.
I guess I was under the impression that the availability letter issued for this particular applicant was basically deeming there to be no additional availability in this area until these upgrades have been approved.
Yes.
Undertaken.
Yes. So
But if these upgrades are not going to be undertaken, then does that automatically mean that there are upgrades that will be needed for the potential user across the highway, depending on who that user may be? For example, if it's a small QSR user or C-store user that might not require upgrades.
So it's basically to the point where, with given all the development in the area, that it's close to that point where, like I said, in engineering opinion, you'd rather do the upgrade than, risk any sort of capacity issues.
Regardless of who the user is,
Yeah.
there needs to be an upgrade performed. Is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brian, just reading some of the staff report. So, and I think so. There's a pump station now. I think original plans was to eliminate it.
Yeah, and that I believe it was in the original PUD. The lower pump station, eliminate that pump station, and then that basin, which is not a part of this basin, but that lower basin could then gravity under the Rutherford Creek to the basically the Rutherford Creek gravity line, the big main 24-inch. But we are not requiring that anymore. It's I guess the old PUD is something we're not going to go by. Tim Tisher does not think we should do that. So in basically the availability letter that they have currently says they can upgrade the upper pump station, the other pump station, to the 455 gallons per minute, and that should satisfy capacity for their basin.
So we're not going down that direction, but just make sure I understand. If we eliminate the lower pump station, it could gravity feed and not require a pump station?
It would eliminate the lower station, which is not, it is a Honey Farm. There are two Honey Farm pump stations. And so it would eliminate one, but you would always have the need for the other pump station, basically. And yeah, it would be an expensive option, more expensive than upgrading this upper pump station. But like I said, it was the former PUD, which we, I guess, should not go by.
Right. Okay. So the way that the current flow is now, does a upper pump to the lower or lower pump go to the
lower to the upper, and then the upper goes across Nashville Highway.
You would basically divert lower to a
Yeah, and you're freeing up the capacity in the upper. Yep.
And as the upper, if this got approved and they upgrade to the 455, does that then put it kind of at capacity? I think that may be what the mayor was asking, or it could allow for some development across the street, but does that kind of peak it out again pretty close? And
It's pretty, yeah, it's close. Like I said, engineering opinion, there's, it will have to go to TDEC for TDEC approval, and they might have a different opinion. But, I think it's close, and I guess in my opinion, it would be enough capacity.
Okay. Any other questions for?
Not for him.
Police Department? Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Mr. Owen, I know you've studied kind of and worked diligently at trying to reduce, some of these variances. Have you looked at a direction of trying to eliminate the variances, like what that picture would look like?
I think a couple that we, I think by nature of the site itself, with the topography, and then trying to adhere to the frontage and the block configuration, the retaining walls is just something that we couldn't eliminate entirely. Just, however that roundabout and the elevation that Honey Farms Way was set at, it's very low, and the site quickly elevates above. And so in order to do, to provide the setbacks, and that's one we probably could not design our way out of. The setback one is just one that we felt was more appropriate to the scale and context of a townhome subdivision. Again, if you kind of look at those PUD-R standards, they're much more suburban. And they're not really indicative of the CCUV overlay. So as you move closer to Nashville Highway, we felt like a more dense product next to commercial is more consistent with the CD4. So again, that was our rationale. And if I may, just, a couple quick points about the sewer. The old PUD there's language in there that goes a couple of ways. It provides both an option for improving the pump station or providing the gravity. And at the time of the PUD agreements, it identified the Rutherford Creek line as being on the west side of the creek and not on the east side of the creek. And so those are some of the things that we're working with. It's a much different question today about sewering under the creek versus connecting to a line that was immediately adjacent to the project. And again, there are provisions in the PUD language for either or. At least that's how our legal counsel has interpreted it. But back to your original question, again, we're trying to balance a lot of different equations here, and I think we've really done our best. Back to the 288 versus the 174. Those are multifamily rental units. This is a high quality for sale townhome product, and we just feel like we're doing our best to deliver a project to the market that meets 95% of the intent across the whole project, and it doesn't. You can't really equate number of variances to how broadly they're being used across the site, but we request your approval tonight, and we appreciate your consideration.
Mr. Rowland, can you speak to like the open space and the civic spaces rather? Like, I guess, can you sell me on what you feel defines this community?
Yeah. You mentioned, Councilmember Coleman, that we're at the lower end of that range that is required in the ordinance. It says 5 to 20% is the range. We are right above the 5%. But there are areas outside of usable open space areas for the residents that we're not counting as civic space because there are certain requirements in the ordinance that say civic spaces have to meet frontage to a thoroughfare. So all those trail spaces, for instance, in front of the units that point north along our buffer, those units that front that triangle space along Honey Farm Way. There are passive spaces that are not in that 5%. So if you were to accumulate those, we'd be well above 10%, maybe 15%.
If you're counting the walking trails as
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
the walking trails both, along those units fronting open space to the north and fronting that kind of triangle shaped space along Honey Farm Way. And the benefit of this new ordinance and the new thoroughfares is that, they create great walkable communities. It puts the driveways behind the units. It puts front porches on these large detached sidewalks with tree lawns. I mean, this whole community is a great kind of walking and trail network just by virtue of the trails we're proposing and the sidewalks that your thoroughfares require. So, I mean, kudos to y'all for that aspect of the ordinance. You're creating a future that's much more walkable for Columbia than it had been in the past. So, I think all those things combined create a pretty desirable community with a lot of good pedestrian features.
I just feel like granting variances, like as Mr. Kellner said, talks about like in order to improve it and make it better. And while it seems like it just kind of, the variances are required to just make it work. And you've come before, like Planning Commission before, with like impressive developments that were exciting for me to vote yes for. But this just feels very lacking compared to a lot of the other things that you brought here before. So the walking trails are great. I'm not seeing a lot of space for where will people congregate. Like where would you have a birthday party or do other things that people do in neighborhoods. So not necessarily a question, but I mean, unless you have an answer, but I'm not seeing that.
In order of that type of use specifically, on the east side of our kind of main green space in the central space, we have a pavilion and a playground area with some passive lawn space surrounding it that would be a great place for a family to invite kids over for a birthday party around that zone. I think, the way that we use open space day to day is really, you get out and you push the stroller, you walk the dog, you put your kid on the bike. And that's kind of what I was hitting on a minute ago, that there's a lot of opportunity for that here. And, if you take the 5% that we're qualifying as civic space and then add the other usable improved open spaces that were, well above, 10 to 15%. So we really see that as the primary benefit.
Ms. Williams.
I'm sure this is in here, and I'm just not seeing it, but so you took away the single driveway in the rear. Did you have to reconfigure the interiors of those units? I mean,
that's a good question. And this was more a result of some conversations with the fire department. Their concern about fighting fires from the alley is that people park illegally in alleys. And the way that our townhomes are set up is that the end units have 2-car garages with a 2-car driveway behind them, and the middle units have a 1-car garage with a 1-car driveway. And so what that did was left a 10 to 12 foot gap between driveways. And so what we said we would do is make all those 1-car driveways 2-car driveways, even though it's a 1-car garage. So it effectively added a third parking space off the street for each of those interior units. And it also removed that perception of, hey, I can parallel park in this alley, right? Because pretty much every linear foot of alley has got a driveway connecting to it. So we felt like that was actually an improvement, both for the off-street parking count, as well as the ability for the HOA and the city to maintain, the peace in the alleys.
so when you do that, how much green space is left between driveways in those middle units? And is it continuous driveways?
No, it's you're still going to have 4 to 6 feet spacing between each driveway. Each unit is about 22 feet wide, and each driveway is about 16 feet wide. So you've got 6 extra feet. So you're going to have some space in there, and it'll be grass. So it won't be a sea of paving down the alley. There will be landscape strips between each driveway.
Spare parking space will just it'll butt up against the rear of the unit.
Correct.
Yeah, just not a.
That's right.
you don't mind, Judge, if I kind of put you on the spot here a little bit and offer a suggestion of maybe how to lessen the exception a little bit. You may have to talk with your client, but Kevin, can you put up the presentation back up and go to the slide where it shows the alley section deviation request? No, sir. Kimley Horn. So on one of the exception is, I think the one that everybody staff understands that you're not going to develop the site no matter what product type you put on here without retainer walls. You're going to have retainer walls no matter what, even though the preliminary didn't show any retainer walls. I guess you could have that discussion later if you go with a final on it, but it's going to have retainer walls. You have lessened those a good bit in a lot of locations. It's the alleyway and deviating the alleyway without a real meaning behind it has been one of our concerns. So on the northern part, have you just thinking out loud, if you removed those units on that northern one, that would remove that exception for that entire alley. It would increase your green space. And then now Planning Commission is just looking at the exception for the lower one, which has a very tall retaining wall in front of it, in which fire, you could justify through the fact that fire would be fighting that from Honey Farm Way and would have to go up a lot of steps and things to try to get to that they can see the reason why now there's a need for the fire to have access to the back in order to service that particular set of units as versus the Honey Farm Way. But it would lessen the exception, it opens up more green space, and it gives a reason to adapt a new standard to the alley section with regards to this PUD that is unique to this site and may not be applied in another site.
And it's only taken away
9, but I don't know what your 150 is. If you can add another unit to one of those units, it may lessen that. You might know that better than me, but
so a total of 9 units.
9 at the top, but if there's a way to add one more unit within that 150 hose pool,
so potentially
it might be less, one, two less, but. Just a thought that I had sitting here. I don't know why I didn't think of it earlier as we've looked at this. I don't know how many times, but
I would
put that in the form of a motion from my perspective.
Well, and I would say that just even simply breaking it up, like how Mr. Kellner suggested, would make a significant difference for me. Of course, I won't be here for very much longer, but I don't know how much my opinion matters now. But I mean, I've lived in a place like this, and I didn't stay there any longer than I had to. So, cause it was just monotony of houses, nothing broken up, nothing really to it. The detention pond's the only thing that's really breaks it up, but of course you kind of have to have a detention pond. So I don't know.
I think y'all are going to be pretty blown away when you see the first development with these new thoroughfares. I mean, these are impressive. Mm-hmm. You have these really nice tree lawns, you have wide sidewalks, you have kind of these dedicated on-street parking. And I wouldn't minimize that because, you went from what was previously a 50-foot right-of-way with little to no grass strip and little 5-foot sidewalks and really it didn't account for on-street parking. Now you have these 65-foot right-of-ways that have these gorgeous tree lawns. They have dedicated parking. They neck down at the intersections for these nice, attractive, kind of safe pedestrian crossings. And I say all that because I know what you're talking about, Councilmember Coleman. The older townhome subdivisions feel very much that way. Your new architecture requirements are pretty rigorous, and in terms of variation in the color palettes, materials, architectural articulation. I mean, we honestly feel like this is going to be a really high quality, good looking project, and that monotony is not what you're going to see and feel when some of those trees are grown in and people are kind of living and walking on those street sections. I'm not authorized to, say, I can approve a reduction in units. I can have a conversation offline if we need to. I personally, Mr. Keltner, don't know that just removing those units, improves the quality of what we're proposing today. I don't know that space in between two buildings is really a quality space where people are going to want to congregate. That's why your civic spaces are kind of pulled out towards thoroughfares, so they have frontage to roads. I don't see a quantifiable benefit. I just wanted to point out that, these thoroughfares that are bigger and broader and more pedestrian friendly and usable really create for some great spaces that happen out in front of buildings. And that's why, we put wider sidewalks in front of those buildings and tried to activate those spaces as well and connect them both to thoroughfares and to other areas. So, again, we would ask for your approval tonight based on the merit of this plan and just kind of the good bones that your ordinance kind of provided us guidance with.
I guess I was just trying to lessen the exception on the part that there's no hardship. It's just a want.
Right.
The other one, there's actually a hardship to associate with it.
Yeah. The comment from my client was that, hey, you open up a whole section on the alley where there's no driveways, and is there a concern about the parking discussion that we had a moment ago? But we, to Mr. Keltner's point, this kind of yin and yang of the fire department requirement and the ordinance that says you can front units onto green space. We're looking at other plans in the city where we're trying to implement that, and we feel like there's benefit to having units that front to green space. And if it means that there has to be we need to work with the fire department and planning staff on a alternate alley section that accommodates that in the future, then we'll certainly be an advocate for it. We have the benefit tonight of being in a PUD that gives us and you the ability to consider our request. So we just feel like, just for continuity and for using the infrastructure that we're building, this does make the most sense for us.
I'd like to make a comment. I'm Drew Smith with Equitas Management Group. We're the property owner. Paul, when you mention hardship, one of the biggest hardships we have is the connectivity requirement. And along our north property line, there's a 36-inch water main that we can't lower, we can't move, so that's really setting the elevation at that north property line, which is requiring very steep drives off of Honey Farm Way at that roundabout at over 8% to get up there. If we didn't have to have that point of connectivity and that water line wasn't there, there's definitely ways that we could move the geometry around that would allow, now they may be very tall retaining walls at the property line, but there may be ways to include another thoroughfare that would front. But I just, when you say there's not a hardship, that 36-inch water line and the connectivity is really a hardship coming off the lowest point of Honey Farm Way at that roundabout to make that connectivity directly straight. We may find other places that we could connect to the north, but that straight shot off the roundabout up 8.5% or 9% to go over that water line is to me, it's a hardship from a topography standpoint.
Yeah, I guess that it naturally has a lot of topography now, though, right? So I guess maybe the lesser exception is just to redesign it and ask for the exception not to have the connection and then get rid of all the other exceptions. If that's what's setting your grade, then just ask for the exception not to have the connection and then just redesign the site off of that. But I'm like you, I don't know how you're going to do it without a lot of retainer walls in there to flatten the site.
I mean,
then you're back to exceptionally tall retainer
you
walls.
reduce them over here and they get bigger over here, one way or the other.
Well, and to your point, Paul, we did request that, and it was important to the engineering department that connection be made, and that we were told that wouldn't be granted.
Sure, and that's still where our stance would be, is to have the connector.
So this product was denied before based on it not conforming to the applicable standards of our PUD requirements. Sounds like conversations we're having right now, that probably not going to be achievable again this time around. So I'm going to make a motion to deny based on 8.521B the product. What's presented here today does not conform to all applicable standards and requirements of our ordinance.
Second.
Have a second by Mr. Coleman. Any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote.
Councilman Coley,
Aye.
Dr. Martin,
Aye.
Mayor Mulder,
Aye.
Mr. Shannon,
Aye.
Mr. Sloan,
Aye.
Ms. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Goode.
Aye. Request is denied.
Thank you for the discussion.
This brings us to other business. Anybody with any other business?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, just two things. So one thing I just wanted for a point of clarification, since this is one of my last opportunities to address it, it came up about the applicant talking about consulting with the land use attorney about their vested right status. And I just want to make clear to the members of the commission that that is an administrative determination. So if you have a question about the current entitlements of any property in the jurisdiction, that would be with planning staff and the Director of Development Services. So that can be, likely would be litigated, contested, but the subject matter experts are planners, not a land use attorney that has no affiliation with the city.
Thank you.
Also,
That is a very good legal disclaimer, Mr. McCarthy. Thank you for that.
The special meeting for the last special meeting of 2024 on zoning text amendments will be December 4th at 4 p.m. here in council chambers.
Thank you. I think there's something I'd like to point out too, just for discussions. I think this is maybe a good opportunity for us to discuss this. I've noticed in some of the water availability letters lately that the water department is promising water in phases now, which is concerning to me. Like this that we're looking at today was 174 units, but it says it's on a phase by phase basis. You know, so I mean, I'm not an attorney, but when we look at something, we approve something, we think they're going to get 174 units, and there's a risk that water is not going to be available for those. So I just, I know we don't have a water representative here for us to talk to today, but that has been a change that I've noticed in water availability letters here lately. That is something that I think we need to be cognizant of, and maybe even have a representative of the water department to come and speak with us about where we stand today, what our expansion plans are, where this is going, as we continue to grow and continue to see the output that our water plant has to produce, and on a daily basis, and seeing that these letters are now starting to indirectly address that issue. I mean, as politely as they can, they're telling us, hey, we can only promise this a little at a time, and I think that's something that we need to really think about and be concerned about, have some direction about.
So are you requesting to have
I mean,
somebody here from Clement Pond Water?
I don't know what the procedure is. I don't know if that's maybe a question for the mayor. Is that something that the mayor and the city council and the water department?
Well, I mean, I know that we do get regular briefings from CPWS, and we have a city council member who's a representative of council. I also know that CPWS certainly would be willing to meet with you directly, individually, Chairman Goetz, as well as any member of this commission, which would probably be what I would suggest, out of the gate. And if further discussion was required, I think that could always happen. But I think that's certainly your prerogative, and because I think it may be that doing it in phases and the way that they're now doing it is actually a more responsible way to do it in the grand scheme of things. As opposed to blanket approvals across the board for large scale. And I think, so there could be sort of a counter argument to your concern, that I would suggest maybe reaching out and getting a meeting with Mr. Harden and their water team.
I think having that, like them come to either planning or city council would be optimal, just so that we make sure everyone hears what the reason for this change in procedure is, the motivation, because otherwise there'll be lots of speculation.
Yeah, I just don't know what agenda to put that on. Something light, maybe, like our, is there such a thing as one of the special meetings that we're having where we're voting on some of the zoning ordinance or something like that? And it may be too soon to try to put it on that December agenda to maybe have a representative there for that. I know that one won't be light because there'll be a pretty large, discussion of several things on that agenda. So maybe just something right now. Maybe I'm not making a recommendation of what we do. Just wanted to kind of bring it out and, in the topic of discussion, and then I'll think about it more maybe by next month to see, and maybe on the mayor's point, I'll have a conversation with the water department myself and see what direction to go, and then readdress it again next month. So,
are you specifically concerned with water, or would you want to hear from other utilities as well?
I mean, it wouldn't hurt for, infrastructure as a whole, as we heard tonight from Ryan with the wastewater department as well, that, I guess I'm still a little bit lost of why we wouldn't look at the old PUD, you know, as to what the whole overall design would be, you know, so maybe just some direction on that, you know, as well. I'm always like to be well informed from the departments, you know, as far as what infrastructure and what, you know, upgrades we need to do, you know, to continue with the growth that we're experiencing.
What if we had like an annual like coming of the minds and they were like, hey, this year we're expecting capacity for this, this, and that, and then it kind of puts it on the docket for the whole year. You can talk to the fire, you can talk to wire, electric, like you talk to everybody.
Yeah, we
all at
do
one time.
have that annual kind of like a continuing ed training, maybe something in conjunction with that of, you know, a briefing of the department.
State of the utilities.
Utility. There you go. Anyway, I'll meet with Water first, and you know, maybe we'll readdress it again in another month. But I just wanted to bring it out, so as it's something I've been thinking about and getting more concerned with. So,
and then I'll also bring up one thing about next month, or the special called meeting on December the 4th.
That's correct.
And that will pertain to a number of amendments to the recent zoning ordinance, including short-term rentals.
Right.
And does staff intend to make any recommendations beyond sort of the information that it's previously provided to this commission, or are we as a commission going to need to come prepared, sort of ready to articulate what would be a very substantive, you know, I mean, it's a pretty significant subsegment of that ordinance. So I didn't know if there's any recommendations that staff is going to have for us.
We'll draft zoning text amendments, so we'll have something for you to review and vote upon based on your direction at the joint study session. But you can go, you know, we're not necessarily recommending that's what you do. It's just this is what we think we heard from you at the joint study session, and it'll be formatted for you to vote on that.
And that'll be a part of the agenda packet.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy.
Oh, I see. I missed it. I'm sorry.
is that another business?
Yeah, I missed it. Sorry.
Thank you. Another business as well. I do think that in other business, I do have a signer that has signed up to speak. Bethany Torino. We'll call you forward, state your name, and you have the floor to express your concerns.
Thank you. I appreciate the 3 minutes. It's very helpful. And I wrote it out so I can be concise so that I don't waste my time. But thank you for being here. I'm Bethany Torino. I'm really here as a citizen, but I do have a nonprofit in town called the Friend Foundation, and we work in the homelessness space. So I have a lot of concerns about homelessness and affordable housing because I see the trickle-down effect of how it is really beyond comprehension how bad things are. And I just want to make sure our Planning Commission is aware and these things are on your mind because I think that you would want to know. So thank you for the opportunity for me to address you about the growing concern in our community. Rising property values are making affordable housing harder to find, and it's placing tremendous strain on our most vulnerable neighbors. Until we can secure long-term solutions, homelessness will continue to increase here in Columbia, affecting individuals and families alike. As you know, winter is fast approaching, and our city currently has no emergency shelter available. The Room in the Inn, which previously provided the shelter, has now shifted its focus to Grace House, a longer-term housing solution that is currently in development, but they're having a lot of trouble, just so you know, with codes and zoning and all of those things. They can't get everyone to the table, I guess. Grace House will be a significant resource for our community, but its shift in focus has left an immediate gap in the winter shelter for those in need. At present, there are at least 200 homeless individuals in Columbia, which I didn't know if you all are aware of. Men, women, children living in cars, tents, under bridges, even abandoned buildings. This population is not being met with any coordinated city or county response. The county is not coordinating anything, the city is not coordinating anything, and they're refusing to work together on it, from what I can assess. I'm encouraging the Planning Commission to keep, response. Right now, no plan or policy is in place to address the most basic needs, leaving a critical gap in how we protect and serve those without a safe place to stay. I encourage the Planning Commission to keep this in mind as you look toward the future and consider housing options. Addressing affordable housing will be essential to reducing homelessness and meeting our city's needs in the long term. In the meantime, the Friend Foundation has created a new initiative called Even the Sparrows to meet this winter's immediate needs. This campaign will fund temporary shelter for the most vulnerable residents on nights when temperatures fall below 32 degrees. Thank you to the support of Richland Inn, we are able to secure reduced rates for situations like this, and every dollar donated to this campaign using this QR code will go 100% to the sheltering, will not be any administrative costs at all with that. I encourage you to, if you want one of the flyers, to share Even the Sparrows campaign with friends, family, and churches that may wish to help. And thank you for your time and leadership and your care for all of our members of the community.
Thank you, Ms. Trina, and thank you for bringing the reminder to us of a very concerning issue. And thanks for that as well. I'll grab one of those on my way out too. So thank you. Any other business tonight to discuss? Seeing none, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Wait.
Oh, you do have something?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
It's a hard act to follow. This isn't nearly as important, but it might save us. And I'm not going to be here. We've got a doctor's appointment on the 4th for that meeting. But as a topic for discussion at a future one, and I would probably try to prioritize it more, is as we look at these different elevations with the glazing requirement, the 70%, that high glazing, it's really meant for a downtown corridor like Ted's or like a shop front. That's the reason it says shop front. Mm-hmm. In our definitions, shop fronts like retail, et cetera, that particular restaurant that we saw was a restaurant and not a shop front. So the glazing requirement should have been lower. And if you think about it, like most of those establishments, you don't want windows or a whole lot of windows in the back of house area, that's what that would kind of create. But I think if we further define or kind of all have an idea of how those two elements are defined. I know that in other jurisdictions, they very clearly have a restaurant, like it says non-shop front and shop front, but they have a better definition of that.
You think it should be less than 50%? 50% is where it's at now.
I had it clicked on here and then I moved away. So non-shop fronts 20 to 60 and shop fronts minimum 50. Are we having them count like where it's calculated, where the 50% is calculated?
The frontage facade.
Just
of what part of the wall? Because we want parapet walls, and like that one, the glazing was above the ceiling level,
That's right. That's why they put the spandrel up there, because it was on the parapet.
And it gets kind of silly. So I think
I don't disagree.
we need to put more parameters on that so that the glazing is actually in a spot that makes sense, and we're not deterring them from creating parapet walls to screen mechanical units that we don't want to see anyway.
It'd be interesting how it's calculated.
Yeah, just to clarify, Mr. Sloan, in the zoning code, every elevation has to have a frontage type, and so you have an office front if it's an office use. A retail restaurant type use falls under a shop frontage type. And so what I'm hearing is maybe you feel like a restaurant use is not appropriate to assign a shop frontage type. In our code, restaurant use is classified as a commercial wheelhouse type. I guess where we might struggle with that, we can think of an oil change business. They're going to have a shop front facade type. All these other businesses have to have a shop front facade. I do understand your point of view. The code is written for an urban downtown facade type, like downtown Columbia.
Where you have one opportunity to put glass.
Yeah.
Generally.
And it's
two if it's a corner.
Which I think the 50% that we created, it doesn't seem like it's having a huge hardship.
Yeah, I think that one you're talking about is under the 70% when they applied.
Yeah. That's right. And they were able to meet they were at 49% with the exception of some minor spandrel glass. But back to Mayor Mulder's point, that's something that staff could have just done a alternative compliance for in-house with the understanding that only a small percentage is the spandrel glass.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's kind of been ironed out, but maybe having a different shop front facade type for a restaurant is what I'm hearing.
I think the understanding of the use kind of driving the amount of glazing just across the board, but also how that glazing is calculated. So how the percentage, I'm trying to remember where I saw it, but there's, from 2 foot low, you wouldn't calculate that. So they'll calculate the percentage from like 2 to 10 feet from the ground floor. And so like, you're not really detracting from, like if they have a screen wall or a parapet wall up there where you wouldn't have glazing anyway.
Sure.
So it sort of artificially pushes that glazing number up because it's only applicable to certain areas of the wall. But anyway,
Point taken.
don't want to belabor.
Sure.
No, I'll be happy
a
to
long
talk to you
meeting.
about it. I think we've made some changes to that to where even what you saw today, it would have been even more conforming actually based on how we measured the front facade as well. So not taking into account this upper story. Yeah, sure.
Any other discussion?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. I think we need to call a vote on that. Discussion.
I mean,
You've already motioned on that, right?
Yeah, we got a motion and a second.
I mean, I can withdraw my motion if it's something that important that you think that can't address staff afterwards or with any member of the commission.
It's a public service announcement, just as part of general comments. It has nothing to do with our.
Well, if it's a PSA, come on up. I'll withdraw my motion if you'll withdraw your second. Better be a good one, though.
It's good. It's about Senate Bill 2315. It's the Residential Infrastructure Development Act. The state approved it this year in March, and it was made active, I think, in June or so. I just wanted to point out that the Middle Tennessee Home Builders Association is hosting an informational session on November 20th at 11:30. I think they're serving lunch. It's up at their Brentwood office. It's a new funding bill to help lower the cost of housing. I think that's just the best way to approach it generally. So I know it's been communicated to some jurisdictions, but just wanted to let you all know that you should come and hear about it. It's a new opportunity for lowering the cost of housing in Middle Tennessee.
Thank you.
Very, very good PSA, Mr. Oldham. Thank you. I'll move to adjourn.
Second.
No motion. Call the vote.
Councilman Coleman,
Aye.
Dr. Martin,
Aye.
Mayor Mulder,
Aye.
Mr. Shannon,
Aye.
Mr. Sloan,
Aye.
Ms. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Dukes.
Aye.